Today, we're diving into a condition so many of you ask about, irritable bowel syndrome, also known as IBS.
There is no simple stool test or blood test or alternative way to just say that shows me everything that I need to know right there.
IBS can feel confusing. The symptoms are hard and the advice, it's often conflicting.
I've wanged on about the importance of fibre consumption, how we've all got to get to the magic 30 grams of fibre a day and how good that is for the microbiome. But I guarantee you there'll be a bunch of IBS sufferers listening to this going, there's absolutely no way that I am doing that because my gut simply cannot take it.
In this episode, we're bringing you the best of our expert conversations. What really is a healthy gut microbiome?
Part of this is diversity within the microbiome. That diversity that exists is a measure of health within any ecosystem.
How do you know when something's out of balance? And what foods can help? And how can you reintroduce them safely? How does stress, anxiety, and mood all fit in?
Depression and anxiety are highly comorbid with IBS, meaning that they very often go together.
When you're anxious, just what you see in the face, you could see in the gut if you could look inside, but we don't see it and you don't feel it.
And most importantly, what really works? You're going to hear practical advice, compassionate guidance from leading voices in the gut microbiome field. Because with the right support, there is a way forward. So join me in this IBS Masterclass. Firstly, I want to say thank you to tuning in and listening to the show. It means a huge amount. And connecting with all of you is something that I absolutely love as part of this journey of growing the show. One of my biggest goals of 2025 is doubling the reach of this show. And I can't do that without your support. So I would love to ask you a favor. If you can press subscribe or follow on whichever platform you listen to. This helps us reach more people. And for me, elevating women in science is so fundamental and ethical and scientific information. So if you feel this show empowers you and gives you the information that you've been seeking, I would love to ask a favor in return and to hit that subscribe button and help me reach the goal that I've set for the show of 2025. Thank you. IBS can feel incredibly frustrating. The symptoms are hard enough, but what makes it even tougher is the sea of conflicting advice, leaving you unsure where to turn or what will really help. So, in this special episode, we brought together some of the most insightful, practical conversations we've had on gut health to make sense of IBS, what might be driving it, what could ease it, and how to move forward with confidence. You'll hear from different voices, different perspectives, but one message shines through. With the right knowledge, the right support, and a bit of patience, it's definitely possible to feel better. We'll explore what a healthy gut really looks like, how diet, stress, nutrition, and lifestyle all fit in. And most importantly, how to work with your body and not against it. So let's begin by asking, what is a healthy gut? And how can we tell when it's out of balance? Let's dive in.
Well, there's not a universally agreed upon definition of what constitutes a healthy gut microbiome, and it's a challenge because the gut microbiome is so complicated. So here's this community specifically within the gut that has 38 trillion microorganisms. Most of them are bacteria, some of them are fungi, and you could also potentially have archaea, protozoa, and then there's definitely viruses in there as well. And like dynamically by the microsecond, it is changing. And it is also like geographically variable. So like one specific part of your colon is not the same as this other part of your colon, right? The sample that you get when you poop is more representative of your rectum, which is the last part of your colon, than it would be of the cecum, which is the first part of your colon. So there's a lot of complexity that's built into that. That being said, to me, when we talk about what is a healthy gut, part of this is diversity within the microbiome. That diversity that exists is a measure of health within any ecosystem. And your gut is an ecosystem, just like the Amazon rainforest, just like the Great Barrier Reef. If you take these places, you take my backyard, and there are mosquitoes, and they annoy me. I don't like them. But you know what? To be honest with you, I don't want them to be gone. And the reason why I don't want them to be gone is because that will have a ripple effect throughout the ecosystem that will have negative consequences. The bats eat the mosquitoes, the birds eat the mosquitoes, the spiders eat the mosquitoes. And so now we start negatively affecting these things, and then it starts basically moving through the food chain. And those negative effects start to basically destabilize the entire ecosystem. That's the way that it works within our gut. There are good guys, there are bad guys. They exist in balance. When they are in balance, which, by the way, we call eubiosis. Eubiosis would be the term for a balanced, healthy gut microbiome. When they're imbalanced, the good guys are outnumbering the bad guys, and there's plenty of diversity. And because there's plenty of diversity, it is a resilient system. It is prepared to do whatever is necessary to basically serve its purpose and to support you and your body. And when we lose that diversity, then effectively we can run into situations where we need our gut to step up and do its job. It's not able to. And the most classic representation of this is when we manifest digestive symptoms. Because there are certain foods that when we consume them, we need our gut microbes in order to properly digest them. Without a healthy gut, you cannot properly digest that food. And so when your gut is struggling to keep up with the demands of what you're asking it to do, because you basically chewed something and swallowed it, and now it's their job. Like, it's time for them to go to work. When they can't keep up, then they're going to let you know. And that's when you get the bloating, the gas, the discomfort, change in bowel habits, maybe diarrhea or constipation, right? That's when we manifest those things. But then there's all these other ways in which a gut can show you that it's struggling. It could be through your metabolism, your blood sugar control, your blood fat control, your cholesterol levels, your weight. It could be through your immune system, the manifestation of allergic symptoms, autoimmune conditions, how you respond to a virus. It could be through your mood, anxiety levels, depression, feeling down, feeling sadness, or alternatively, feeling optimistic and energized and having tons of energy. So these are all sort of different ways in which an unhealthy gut, we could get into hormonal stuff as well. To answer your question, there is no simple stool test or blood test or alternative way to just say that shows me everything that I need to know right there. Ultimately, we need a holistic view. And that holistic view takes into effect all of these different aspects, including symptoms that affect our digestion or our metabolism or our immune system, or our mood or hormones.
As you're talking about this, I remember kind of my own journey, which, I won't get into loads and I don't talk about that much on here, but it was a very long process to understanding like what was the root cause of this. And one test showed something, one test didn't show something. And so it was a kind of a complex mix of, I just became more confused during the process. And so I think that's something that's really important, that when we talk about a healthy gut, everyone is so individual in their approach to this. Everyone has different levels of what they believe their gut health to look like. And I think that's where it can become so confusing, because you look online and you basically see, have you got bloating? Have you got diarrhea? How many times a day do you have a bowel movement? And sometimes it can be a very simple checklist, and we can actually mismatch a lot of our symptoms. So for anyone like listening to this now, what would you say is kind of like the key approach to looking at whether they can help starting to analyze if they do have a healthy gut or an unhealthy gut? And if they feel like they're leaning more towards an unhealthy gut, for you as a gastroenterologist, what would you say is important on the next steps and what to take there? Because I do feel that I see so many patients and they have gone through so many hoops to try and figure out what's wrong with them and ended up in complete despair. And I think that's something that is actually only growing on the kind of side of social media and mismatch of information. So what advice would you give there?
Yeah, it's, I think that the frustrating thing is because there's not this like universal, hey, this is the one way to basically figure this out, then, like you could have someone whose opinion I respect who might sit here and say something slightly different than me. So to me, there's three ways in which I think about this. This is the way that I approach this as a gastroenterologist. The three ways are, number one, are you having the symptoms that manifest when a person has an unhealthy gut? So when the gut is not in a good place, you should be manifesting symptoms. Now, let's first of all, recognize that just because you have symptoms occasionally does not mean you have a problem. So occasional bloating, we all get that, right? Mm-hmm. Or maybe an occasional reflux, or there's certain things that will happen once in a while. To me, when it's a chronic issue that is occurring with enough frequency that it is negatively affecting your quality of life, that's when we have crossed the line. And classically, these are digestive symptoms, but it could also include things that are throughout your entire body. So it could be skin changes, fatigue, brain fog, difficulty with focus. Those are some of the things outside of the gut that could also be manifesting that would be indicative of something going on there. Okay, so number one, symptoms. Number two, health-related issues. If a person has a chronically damaged gut, which the term that we use is dysbiosis, but sometimes people refer to this as leaky gut or something like that. If a person has dysbiosis, meaning a chronically damaged gut, then they will likely manifest chronic conditions that are associated with dysbiosis. And there's a very long list. So within my space, if you were to come see me as a gastroenterologist, irritable bowel syndrome, acid reflux, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, celiac disease, we could keep going. Chronic constipation. That's just within the world of a gastroenterologist. But then there's a number of different specialists or different types of doctors that you might see for different issues. You may be having migraine headaches. You go to a neurologist for this. You could have type 2 diabetes and go to your primary care or an endocrinologist. When you look at the list of health-related conditions that you have, if they are associated with a damaged gut, then you know what's going on. And the third thing is looking at a person's bowel movement. So now we have stigmatized this, that's all, you're not allowed to go there, Dr. B. We're not allowed to talk about
I
poop.
all of my patients with a poo chart. We get straight on in.
Yeah. I think it's very important that we normalize this because, much like if I were a cardiologist, I would be a horrible cardiologist if I didn't listen to your heart, right? If I just talk to you, then what does that make me as a cardiologist? And in the same respect as a gastroenterologist, the most telling window into what's happening with your digestive system and with your gut microbiome is your bowel movement. And the reason why is because it reflects your microbiome and it reflects your entire digestive process. So when we're having good, normal, healthy bowel movements, which are soft but formed like a sausage, and also there's an experiential element to this, not just how it looks, but also how do you feel? When you strut out of the restroom, in slow motion with doves flying up into the air and fireworks shooting off in the background, and you're just hell yeah, then you're in a good spot. You're having healthy bowel movements. Yeah. And I would give you, after you wash your hands, I would give you a high five. Okay. But flip side, if you kind of sheepishly come out of the restroom and you're not satisfied and you kind of feel like you still have to go, and it was a little dinky bowel movement that you struggled to get out, you're not where you need to be. So that to me is another window into what's going on with your body that kind of tells us what's going on.
So we've got symptoms, be aware of all the different symptoms and how frequent. I think that's such a big thing because so many of us occasionally might get bloating, bit of distension in our gut, and there's no room for panic unless it's happening all the time and it's causing you, as you said, a real kind of change in your day-to-day life. And I think that's so important because especially for women, I think that's such a fundamental thing to be aware of. So for an adult, we're not thinking about, and I'm going to get into this, into infants and babies and birth and older age, but as an adult, just thinking categorically, we can't answer if we know we've got a healthy gut microbiome because there's lots of tests out there that people can come back and say, you've got this many gut bugs and this many good and bad. But you're saying, well, actually we're so different that is that actually true reflection if we've got good or bad healthy gut microbes or not?
We've gone into testing. I mean, man, that is a can of worms. So I'll give you my perspective on it.
I say it because I think a lot of people listening to the show are dying to know about it and it's a minefield.
So the microbiome testing is the Wild West. And most of the direct-to-consumer tests that you buy are not very helpful. And the reason they're not very helpful is because the sequencing technology that they use to measure metataxonomy, that word that we used before, don't really give you much precision. So they don't get you a description of what's happening at a species level. So, bugs can be described based on their, their phylogeny, right? And we can think about a phylum, a family, a genus, or a taxon. We can go all the way down to species or strain. And they tell you nothing about species or strain. So they lack any form of depth and any form of accuracy. And so they don't properly tell you about that variance between people. And they don't tell you with any precision precisely which bacteria they're measuring. And the other problem is that they all apply different bioinformatic tools. So they all apply different computational ways of measuring that data. And what that means is that you're quite often not really comparing apples with apples. And that information is also quite often linked to perhaps questionable marketing data around the consumption and sale of probiotics or prebiotics, or they're basically trying to sell you something else, right? And they're very expensive. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be testing microbiomes that I do in my clinical practice, but I use very specific tools that I understand both the advantages and limitations to, and I look for very specific measures of what those bugs particularly are doing. If we take a step back again and we think about the broader medical community or scientific community, we're now also beginning to start to apply some standards. And so that we all understand what we mean when we say specific things, and that we regulate perhaps a little bit more of what these tests are actually doing. And so that the results of those tests are communicated in a meaningful way. So many of you might have had your microbiomes tested and you get like 90 pages of results and it's just utterly meaningless. And I can't understand it. There's no way a consumer can understand it. And it's basically a waste of your time. That data has to be understood in context of a specific health problem, and you've really got to know what you're looking at.
So would you say the only way to understand if you've got a healthy versus unhealthy microbiome, to put it in a very simplistic term, is symptomatic?
No, what I would say is that if you want to understand it, you've got to measure it longitudinally in yourself over time. So you've got to understand that when you measure it, it's a snapshot of where you are at any given moment. And that's actually at the core of why microbiome science is so important. It's very much unlike your genome, which is incredibly stable and doesn't change. The microbiome is quite stable in terms of its metataxonomy, so who's there, right? It shouldn't really shift and change. But if you go out and take a medicine, you go out and take an antibiotic, you have an operation, you go away and you get traveller's diarrhea, it really will shift. And what you want to know is that it's coming back to where it was, where it should be in you. So quite often when I'm doing wellness checks in my patients or they come to see me, I say, actually, let's just get a baseline measure. And let's understand the limitations of that measurement, and let's put it in the bank and know that we've got a reference point for where you were at any given moment in time. And let's also just understand that it's not telling us about quite a lot of the other really key determinants of your microbiome health, like the virome we discussed. Most of these tests, they don't measure the virome at all. And let's understand that it doesn't tell us about function. And then we'll just apply those tools as and when we need them to give us those insights that we need. So they are helpful tests if they're used correctly and in the right way. And you can tell a little bit about the resilience, the diversity. You can tell a little bit about whether or not you've got too many of these bad actors, pathogens or pathobionts, and not enough probiotic strains. Those are useful things to know, but you just have to understand the limitations of the analysis. I think you can answer that question at a societal level and at an individual level, right? And I think we'll start with the societal big picture because I think that's the more interesting question. I think what we've seen is a dramatic change in the microbiome since the Second World War, since the 1940s. And I think many of those drivers you would obviously think about. So nutrition and diet, you're super interested in. Obviously, that's important, right? We've got a westernized diet, high in fat, high in animal protein, low in fiber. The gut microbiome loves a bit of fiber, right? We're just not getting enough. And these things are important. But actually, I would argue that there's been some much more damaging forces on the microbiome that are not often considered and properly talked about. And the number one has to be misuse of antibiotics. Right. So we consume an extraordinary amount of antibiotics, 38 billion daily doses a year. Antibiotic prescribing has gone up by 65% globally since 2000. Most of these antibiotics are prescribed in children. Most of them are prescribed in the low and middle income countries. And most antibiotics, 80% of antibiotics, are not used in humans. They're used in animals. And they're used to sustain our farming practices, right? It comes back to food production. And this has been catastrophic for the global microbiome, for the planetary microbiome, because in a space of 70 years, we've had an industrialization of that, the manufacture of and misuse of antibiotics. And we see from endless epidemiological studies, really good longitudinal studies in individual cohorts, that if you have recurrent dosing of antibiotics when you're very young and your microbiome is developing, so between the age of, birth, or even, we can get onto the maternal microbiome because that's another interesting concept, but certainly from birth to about the age of 5, and you're having broad spectrum antibiotics, the consequences of that on your microbiome are very significant. Now, we can get into the weeds of antibiotics, but other kind of important factors would be our complete reliance on polypharmacy. So taking multiple medicines to try and solve our diseases of progress. So we take 4 trillion doses of medicines across the world each year, which means half the world's population takes a medicine every single day. And many of these medicines that we take that we don't think about as being antibiotic are in fact antibiotic. So particularly medicines used in mental health problems like antidepressants, very good example, right? Painkillers, proton pump inhibitors, medicines that help regulate our lipids, our fats in our blood, all have a very significant impact on our gut microbes, and we just don't think about it. Also, we've got other big kind of social economic forces. So we're becoming urbanized. And when you become urbanized, lots of things happen. You don't just become more exposed to pollutants or kind of environmental toxins like plastic, but you also change your social network. Our social networks are changing, which means that family sizes are shrinking. The real world network of people that you hang around is getting smaller. And on top of that, we've got a global population which travels, which moves between communities. And these things are so important in the evolution and development of the microbiome in early life. So the answer to your question, I believe, is that some people are vulnerable because their microbiome is damaged at a very early moment in their life where it's very susceptible, where it lacks that resilience that we talked about that defined a healthy microbiome. So in my practice, you talked about irritable bowel syndrome. Terrible name. Terrible name for an awful condition which really destroys people's lives. I always take an antibiotic history and I always go right back to early life. I'm like, when you were a kid, were you an ear infection kid? Were you a tonsillitis kid? Were you a kid that had allergies like eczema? Were you a kid that had your appendicitis out, your appendix out? Because these children always get high doses of antibiotics. And, you know, the mean dosing of antibiotics in children is really, really frightening. So that's the answer to your question. A caveat, I'm not anti-antibiotics, right? Antibiotics are really precious, really important drugs. I work in a hospital where Alexander Fleming, discovered penicillin. I can't do my job without antibiotics. But we have to just be so much more careful with how we use them because frankly, they don't work anymore anyway. We're running out, and that's another problem, right? Yeah. So we need antibiotics. And if you're sick and you're listening to this and you've got a bacterial infection, and your doctor says, hey, you really need them, take them. We can talk about what you might want to do to protect yourself whilst you're taking them. But I think what happens is that some people just don't have their microbiome constructed and assembled adequately. And that means it lacks that resilience. And then when they become adults, they simply cannot adapt to an environment which stresses the microbiome and stresses the gut on a daily basis.
So what we're really hearing is that diversity is key to a resilient gut microbiome, and that while testing can offer some clues, it's not a substitute for the bigger picture or a more personalised approach. Next, let's explore how we can support that diversity, especially when it comes to food and nutrition, and why slow, steady changes could be a powerful option. A lot of people mentioned before when we were talking about fibre, and we didn't talk about resistant starch. We're thinking about these foods that are high in resistant starch and these foods that are high in fibre or plant compounds. Lots of people get worried about IBS, IBD symptoms and having a huge load of fibre. But obviously what we're saying is this is really important for our gut barrier to reduce inflammation, to help, support and reduce disease. What do you say to those people that are listening that might struggle to have fibre? What's the answer for them?
So first of all, I'm grateful for the opportunity to address this issue because sometimes in nature, things are nuanced. This is an example. Sometimes it's not so completely straightforward and linear at all times. And there was a book that came out a few years ago that I'm personally not a fan of called The Plant Paradox. And I would argue this is the true plant paradox. This is the true plant paradox because the paradox is that the people who need fiber the most, these people with IBS and inflammatory bowel disease, are the people who will also struggle the most to introduce fiber into their diet. So I would like to unpack this for a moment and then explain the
Yeah.
path forward. So first of all, I am not here to say that everyone should take their diet and add 30 grams of fiber today. That's a bad choice for pretty much all of us. The thing about fiber, and we can include resistant starch if we want. Resistant starch tends to be a little more gentle. But the thing about fiber is that the human digestive system does not have the ability to digest fiber. It's the microbes, right? So the microbes produce the enzymes. So what is the case if you have a microbiome that hasn't been processing fiber, that lacks the enzymes to digest and process the fiber? What happens when it's January 1st and you radically transform your diet and you go 100% whole food plant-based all at once? You will be miserable. And the reason why is because of the mismatch between the digestive capacity of your microbiome and what you're putting into your mouth and swallowing. Your gut microbiome has been trained already. Like all of us, we have a trained microbiome. It's been trained to whatever you've been eating in the last 2 months. So to make a dietary change, we have to allow the opportunity for adaptation. Because as you add high fiber foods to your diet, it's not that you lack the microbes and they can never be grown. It's that those microbes are not properly represented because that's not what you've been eating. When you add fiber to your diet, you will start to get those microbes represented. Now, you could go hard and like ramp up your fiber aggressively and you will be miserable. But at some point, it will get better because the microbes will catch up. Flip side, that's not what I'm advocating for. Sometimes I think people think that they hear me say that. No. I have a saying that I've been pounding this drum for many years now. I have a saying, low and slow is the tempo.
Love that.
Now, conveniently, I grew up in the 80s, and this is a Beastie Boys song. Right? So when I was a kid, low and slow is the tempo. I was like, yeah, like I'm like waiting for the school bus. Low and slow is the tempo. All right. So this is a Beastie Boys song, but it's also the way that we should approach introducing fiber and plant-based foods to our diet, because the gut conceptually is like a muscle. It can be trained. It can be made stronger. A person who has IBS or particularly inflammatory bowel disease, that muscle is not strong. I promise you, it is not. In fact, that muscle needs to be rehabbed. Not just made stronger. It needs to be rehabbed. And the way that we rehab a muscle is by starting with what you're actually capable of doing. And over time, slowly increasing that and doing more. And so low and slow is the tempo basically means that you start with where you are today and you gently add a little bit more over time. And by doing it slowly and gently and backing down if you need to because you're starting to get bloated or other digestive symptoms, by doing it that way, your gut, you're giving it the time to catch up. You're giving it the time to adapt. You're bringing forward the microbes that will help you to process and digest these food. You are capable. This is the message of hope and optimism. You are capable of having a healthy gut. We all are capable of having a healthy gut. You're not stuck. But the issue is that you need to rehab your gut and you need to start with where it is today, which may be more of a challenge, and then gently ease it up. And what you will discover is that you will start to become capable of processing this food without any symptoms, without any bloating. Next thing you know, this is a powerful part of your diet and you're thriving and feeling the best that you've ever felt. And that IBS or that inflammatory bowel disease, it's, to be clear, impossible to cure. You can't cure it. But if you put it into remission where you are no longer having symptoms, and if you have an inflammatory bowel, no longer having flares, if that's where you get to, and it never turns back because you have made some change to your diet that allows you to accomplish this, that's effectively a cure. A permanent remission is the same.
So because you're a gastroenterologist, and I'm just thinking if somebody came in with IBS or IBD to see you, some gastroenterologists, and I don't know if you would do this, would say go on an exclusion diet or start stripping back loads of foods. And what I hear you say is, don't be scared of these foods, introduce them slowly. And I think there's this like very foggy landscape where people are so confused about what is hurting their gut that they either become quite scared of food and they totally strip it out of their diet until they've stopped having symptoms, which can massively reduce their intake of nutrients, but they're not in pain. Or they feel so overwhelmed that they don't know where to start and they carry on with these symptoms. Yeah. So what would be your take on how you would then advise somebody? What would you do if somebody came in with those symptoms to you?
Well, so I've dealt with this scenario a bazillion times, because irritable bowel syndrome is the most common diagnosis that exists in a gastroenterologist practice. And so there are a few things here. First of all, I can't speak for the entirety of all gastroenterologists across the globe. There's millions. There's millions of gastroenterologists. And with the internet and social media, you will find someone who will advocate for everything.
Yeah.
Right? So if you have some sort of bias and want to fulfill that bias, you will find someone in another country somewhere in the world that says that, and 99.999% of their peers may say that person is insane, and we completely disagree. And yet, if that's what you want to hear, you'll call that person a genius. And that's the world that we live in. The evidence, first of all, with regard to fiber and these conditions is clear. It's clear. People who introduce fiber into their diet, increase the fiber in their diet, this leads to better health outcomes. There's no dietary guidelines that are advising people to eliminate fiber from their diet. Temporary is a totally different thing. Temporary is part of a process. Permanent elimination, permanent restriction, that does not exist aside from people who have specific medical conditions, like celiac disease. It's a totally different thing. Like you can't take celiac disease and then generalize that out to other people who don't have celiac disease. So now when we look at like what happens in the gut microbiome when people reduce diversity within their diet, we have a number of different studies where this is the case. People may be following a gluten-free diet. And again, like if you have celiac disease, you should, but people may be following a gluten-free diet. People may be eliminating FODMAPs from their diet. And when people make these choices consistently, the gut microbiome appears less healthy in our studies. So regardless of the dietary patterns of restriction and exclusion are not the optimal long-term approach. It's clear that diversity and abundance is actually the way forward. Now, sometimes we will take one step backward so that we can take two steps forward. And that's part of the process that I describe in my second book, which was the Fiber Fields Cookbook. In the Fiber Fields Cookbook, one of the things that I'm proud of is that the book was made for people who have this exact issue, Saran. People that have irritable bowel syndrome or are struggling to add more plant-based foods to their diet, because I want to help you accomplish that, because clearly I wholeheartedly believe in this. And so what I did is I put 2 dietary protocols in there. Basically, like just eat the recipes that are in the book. Read the chapter, eat the recipes, and it will help you sort this out. So the 2 that are in there are FODMAPs, a low FODMAP diet, and histamines, a low histamine diet. And these are things where you might actually temporarily eliminate these things like FODMAPs and histamines, go low FODMAP, low histamine. And that's a diagnostic process. That's temporary. You're going to bring it back on board. The other thing I would say real quick is the days of a one-stop shop for healthcare are gone. And so if you go to your doctor expecting your doctor to be all things all at once, that's a mistake. You need to build a team. And when it comes to nutrition, that team should include a person who's adequately qualified to talk to you about nutrition, which to me is a registered dietitian.
I think that's really important, right? Having the support, but also having the time to do this and making sure that you're actually setting out time where you are doing this properly is probably one of the biggest key factors to helping understand your gut health. There were so many important reminders in there. And that's why rebuilding gut health takes patience. And that diet can play a big role in not just how we digest our food, but also how we feel emotionally too. Now let's turn to the connection between our gut microbiome and our mind, and how stress, anxiety, and mood all connect to IBS. In England, it is estimated that 1 in 6 people in the past week experience a common mental health problem. So when we think about IBS, and we talk a lot about IBS, It's actually 1 in 10 people with IBS, but it's 1 in 6 people with a mental health problem. Yet it's still so stigmatized. And I think we talk more about gut health problems than actually about mental health problems, even though they're very much closely related. And mental health problems, they are on the rise. And 1 in 5 deaths is associated with poor diet.
Dr. Heidi Stoudacre in our team, she did her PhD at King's College in London, is really one of the world experts on IBS and diet and the gut. And now she's really looking closely at mental health because depression and anxiety are highly comorbid with IBS, meaning that they very often go together. And of course, you've got this bidirectional communication between the brain and the gut. They talk to each other all the time. So if you're really stressed or worried or what have you, that will affect your gut and vice versa. So you can actually do a top-down and or a bottom-up approach, like literally. So the top-down are things like hypnotherapy, antidepressants, relaxation, all of those things that are apparently helpful in IBS. I'm not the expert
Mindfulness,
here.
meditation.
Yeah, those sorts of things. And you can also take dietary approach to it. I think, again, there's some really interesting data that Heidi's generated from a trial that she's done that's not yet published, so I can't talk about it, but it addresses this very thing. There was a great study published last year. It was only a small study, but it was published in Cell. It was led by the Sonnenbergs, who are a fantastic duo over in America, who are microbiologists, I think. And what they did was they took Americans who largely have a really terrible diet. We call it the SAD, the standard American diet. And they wanted to see whether they could increase the diversity of the gut microbes and reduce inflammation through dietary approaches. So one group were helped over a period of 2 or 3 weeks to increase their intake of fermented foods. That was the only thing they changed, fermented foods, so yogurt, kefir, kombucha, sauerkraut, etc. Up to 6 serves a day. And now, remember, a serve only needs to be small. And then the other group were helped to increase the amount of fibre in their diet. So whether it was lentils, beans, grains, these sorts of things. And what they saw was that the people in the high fermented foods diet, their gut microbiota diversity went up and their inflammation went down. So yay, that was a win. In the other group, the high fibre group, some people did really well. Inflammation down, diversity up. Others did really badly. And they thought, well, hang on. If these people have got like a desert-like microbiome or a microbiome that doesn't have the bacteria that we know that are needed to break down fibre, because that's the primary role of the gut bacteria, is to break down the bits of food that our human enzymes can't break down, which is primarily fibre from complex carbohydrates and also the polyphenols from the plants. If they don't have those bacteria, they're not going to be able to break the fibre down, and that could cause a problem. And they thought, well, maybe there might be undigested fibre in the stool, which would tell us whether this is true or not, and that's what they found. So if people had low diversity to start with, they just did not do well with a high fibre diet. And so again, you'll see people saying, I can't eat that, I can't eat that. Now, that may well be true. So you need support to be able to improve your gut, whether it's both, I would say, top-down and bottom-up approaches. So relaxation, hypnotherapy, all of those sorts of things that we know are really helpful for people with IBS, but also very, very gradual changes to your diet. If you're going to introduce fibre, do it really slowly. Take little bits of fermented foods with the high fibre foods so that you're helping your gut to start to adapt.
I love that tip.
Yeah.
Take fermented foods with small bits of fibre and also drink a lot of water because, again, that's really important.
Now, I should specify there's no research to confirm that yet. This is just a hunch based on what we see so far in the literature. It's certainly worth a go, but this is where dietitians are so important. People go on these low FODMAP diets. They're never meant to be more than short term.
6 weeks, yeah.
Yeah, but people just stay on them and they avoid FODMAPs. But FODMAPs are actually key food for the gut microbes. You're only going to make the problem worse by avoiding them. So I think that is a strategy that hopefully will be tested soon and people will be able to actually go, okay, so this for me might be helpful.
IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and IBD, irritable bowel disease, 2 different syndromes. And I was just looking at some stats, and these are quite similar between the UK and the US. So 39% of IBS patients experience anxiety. 29% of IBS patients experience depression. 1/3 of IBD patients experience anxiety, and 1/4 of IBD patients experience depression. And so they might change very slightly between the two countries, but overall, generally, we're seeing that this is quite a big percentage of people that suffer with gut problems and people that suffer with their mental health. So I want to start there, really, with the stats. Why is it so important to talk about this in combination as opposed in isolation?
So before I start my answer to you, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this show. It's really a pleasure talking to you and about topics that obviously are very important to me as well as they are to you. So this observation that anxiety, a brain-generated phenomenon, is associated with these traditionally pure bowel disorders, so for a long time IBS was only considered a gut disease. Still for a lot of my colleagues it is, and IBD even more. Most IBD specialists do not consider the brain playing any significant role. Has changed a little bit in recently, but it's not surprising because anytime you have a chronic disturbance of your bowel function, there's such close connections to the brain, particularly to the emotional parts of your brain, that you almost have to have some sort of a associated brain component or mental component to it. It would be hard to explain biologically why that would not be the case. And it's probably a little bit different between IBS and IBD. And we've done many studies comparing those two populations. So you mentioned the anxiety, but it's also a lot of patients with inflammatory bowel disease still have symptoms, IBS-like symptoms, when they're in full clinical remission. So when their mucosa has healed and there's no inflammatory markers, fecal calprotectin in the stool. So they still have these symptoms. And, gastroenterologists are always trying to figure out, well, maybe the dose of treatment wasn't high enough, we have to, or they need new IBD treatments. But it's much more likely, I think, that this is the mental component of this disease. And anxiety is something, I would say, any emotion like anxiety, same thing for depression, maybe a little bit less. The gut always has a mirror image of what goes on in those emotional circuits within your brain, these networks. Like you can tell this easily if you look at somebody's face and this person is anxious, you can see it in the face. And the same reaction our gut has. So when you're anxious, just what you see in the face, could see in the gut if you could look inside, but we don't see it and you don't feel it because that connection also affects the brain in a long-term way. So the anxiety is something that you have at the moment when your gut acts up, or you have a spasm, or you have the urgency, or you're afraid to go to a restaurant because you think you might not make it to the bathroom. But the long-term effect of that inflammation in the gut is that it affects the brains structurally. So it affects,
wow, in what way?
It affects your cognitive circuits within the brain. And there are large studies that have shown it's a risk factor for developing early cognitive decline if you have untreated colitis. Not everybody will get that, but if you have. So
wow.
I would say these two diseases are very similar in terms of the anxiety, in terms of probably also in terms of symptom perception. So this symptom-related fears, for example, are present in both disorders. And so uncontrolled diarrhea, fecal incontinence, having cramps. There's always this anxiety related to the symptoms.
Yeah, I think most people who might be having gut problems but might have not labeled them or might not have either of these two conditions. Why should people be more aware of this? Because I think we can very quickly isolate, I've just got a bad tummy, or I'm suffering with brain fog or low mood. But very rarely do we put these together. So why is it important that we have to be aware of this?
Well, it is important because, the the treatment is similar in both situations. So, for example, a largely plant-based diet like the Mediterranean, the traditional Mediterranean diet, has been shown to be beneficial. I mean, it has to be modified, but it has to be beneficial in both IBS and IBD. In IBD, that insight only came a few years ago because IBD docs did not pay attention to diet at all, just like other gastroenterologists. But then studies came out that actually, if you're in remission, a largely plant-based diet with lots of fiber and polyphenols is actually beneficial and protects against the recurrences. The opposite was recommended earlier, that people said. Now, if you have a flare, this may not be true. You may go on a
low fiber.
Little fiber in diet, but that's so two different phases. The other thing is techniques that target the mind, work in both conditions. So mindfulness-based stress reduction, all the self-relaxation techniques, cognitive behavioral therapy, they all work in both conditions. In IBD, maybe more in the subsets of patients that have the anxiety. So if you're in IBD, and these diseases are heterogeneous. It's not every patient is the same, but somebody who has more of these mental symptoms, they will definitely benefit from those techniques that are also been shown in IBS to work. Now, this concept runs into a lot of opposition from IBD physicians. Is that like in our institution, like when I give a lecture and talk about this, then the senior people get up and said, I don't want that anybody who leaves this seminar come away with the message that treating the brain has any benefit for IBD. So there's still this ingrained thing.
That's really sad.
It's really sad.
Because you talk a lot about the bi-directional response.
Yeah.
I think I read that you don't like the word gut-brain connection or something like that because it is bi-directional. And we have signals coming from the brain via the vagus nerve into the gut, and vice versa. We have a huge amount of signals coming from the gut up the vagus nerve into the brain. So they're constantly communicating. So I still find that is secure science. So I still find it odd that gastroenterologists are fighting the idea that using the mind as well as another alternative therapy to help treat these gut conditions shouldn't be acknowledged.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it's gotten better in some major academic institutions, like at UCLA. We have a program, a digestive wellness program that deals with this. There's other places like Johns Hopkins. There's several other places now, big academic centers that. But for the general practitioner, that's not something that they really. But I always remember the time, when I gave lectures to patients, to IBD patients. So my first question was always, so how many people in the room? There were like 50 people. How many people in the room think that the brain or that stress plays any role in their symptoms? And every hand went up.
My hand's going up now.
And when you ask that same question to a IBD specialist, they would say, "No, that this has nothing to do with each other. Different issues." And there is one reason that patients for a long time refused it, because for physicians, something that goes on in the mind is just psychological. It's not a real
psychosomatic.
Problem. Yeah, but I do want to emphasize, things are improving, so the brain-gut concept and the mind-gut concept has clearly, and I would say in the last 10 years, has really improved significantly. And younger, so I see it in the pre-med students that come to us to do some work to get into medical school. Most of whom are actually women. Maybe that has to do with it as well, that women have more intuitive insight into these connections. And So I think it's a good thing. It's a good development.
So you believe that IBS, and this is not IBD, is not just a gut disorder, and you actually advise cognitive behavioral therapy for people that suffer with IBS. So maybe let's start there, because I really want to get on to the food in a second, but let's start with the mind, which is important. So how can CBT also, which is abbreviated, be helped as a useful tool for people that suffer with IBS?
So it's a big part of a big mechanism how the brain works is based on expectations. It makes projections on within minutes what's going to happen, and more long term, and then and these are influenced by emotions. So these projections, or these anticipations what's going to happen plays a big role in creating anxiety, and then stimulating the sympathetic nervous system to go down to the gut and actually cause the symptoms. And if you can just deal with this fear, or this anxiety and fear of disease, that's a big part of IBS. And we know what the circuits within the brain are. There's these salient circuits. The brain constantly, just like a self-driving cars, that constantly monitors the environment and then makes predictions of what's going to happen, along the way, within seconds, within minutes, within hours. If that system is biased towards being more sensitive, then so the self-driving car would stop at a lot of places where it doesn't have to stop, And the same thing happens with IBS. If that system constantly generates signals that then turn the warning lights on.
It is so encouraging to hear how approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, and dietary changes can all work together to calm and ease gut symptoms. Finally, we're going to take a look at what harms the gut microbiome and what can really help protect it and restore it, especially when it comes to our lifestyle, medications, or stress, which all can take a toll. If you've had high doses of antibiotics, how should we be thinking about this? Or if you're somebody taking antibiotics now, what's the protocol to protect the gut microbiome?
So I think when you're taking an antibiotic, there's a couple of things you should do. I mean, the first thing is you just talked about sensitivities. So you want to have a discussion with your physician that goes, hey, am I taking the narrowest spectrum antibiotic that I possibly can for this particular problem that I have? That means that they should be culturing whatever they think is infected and really trying to identify that particular bug, so we make sure you are on the right antibiotic that you precisely need. That's number one. Number two, you should be thinking, well, how do I protect my ecosystem, and how do I make sure that the antibiotic that I am taking is working as effectively as possible? And then diet and nutrition becomes so important. So we know people that have a westernized diet, that have a high fat, low fiber diet, high in animal fats, their antibiotics don't work as well, and they have higher rates of antimicrobial resistance. And if you take a high fiber, plant-based diet when you're sick, that reverses that trend, and it's really impactful. There's this old sort of cliche, isn't there, of people who are sick, they get by their bedside, they have a big bottle of Lucozade and have sugary drinks, and you buy sweets for your family members. That is just absolutely the wrong strategy, and that's got to go.
Isn't that mad though? That's what hospitals are laid out to be like.
Yeah.
So when I was in hospital, my wonderful mother would traipse to M&S or somewhere outside and bring me in fresh food to eat because it was just so poor. And it's interesting that actually when we need it the most, when you say we're actually just laced with ultra processed foods.
We do. I remember when I was a very junior doctor, trundling through the resus bay of this emergency department I was working in. This poor woman was having a heart attack, and back in the day, we used to dissolve blood clots with quite strong drugs. And I remember we were thrombolizing her, and I just walked in. I turned my back for 2 minutes. The next minute, she was eating a bucket of chicken wings. So nutrition and diet is something that is often in a stressed busy hospital environment where we don't fund and pay our dietitians enough and we don't have enough dietetic resource, it's the thing that gets forgotten. But if you're coming back to our question and you're taking antibiotics and you're sick, it's the one thing that you can have absolute control of. And actually the choices that you make are extremely important. So no ultra processed foods, please, no refined sugars, no booze, sorry, but no booze. If you're sick, you shouldn't be doing it anyway. And trying to move towards a plant-based diet. And you can supplement that with some fermented foods that will help improve the diversity of the microbiome in your gut. And you can even supplement it with either a prebiotic or a probiotic. Either of these things are fine. Or during.
So it won't kill the probiotic or the prebiotic, because that's what I thought, that if you took a probiotic during it, it basically just kills it anyway.
Well, that's probably true to a degree. So it will have an antibiotic effect, assuming, of course, that the probiotic strain is sensitive to antibiotic that you're taking. So that is true. But no, some will culture and will engraft. And what you know, when you take an antibiotic, it's interesting, isn't it? We rarely think about the effect that it might have on our kind of other microbes. So if you take a broad spectrum antibiotic, you will probably have a decline in your gut microbiome population by about 40,000 fold. You'll have an absolute decimation of that ecosystem. And there were some quite interesting studies that were done at the University of Washington that were published in, I think it was Cell, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, that they took a group of healthy people and they gave them a single dose of a broad spectrum antibiotic called azithromycin. And then they compared them to a control population and also to a group of patients that have been in intensive care. And what we found is that some patients in that group were very susceptible to antibiotics and in terms of their microbiome. And what they saw is a catastrophic loss of diversity that in some cases just never recovered. And that was a single dose of antibiotics. In fact, it was so bad, it resembled that of an intensive care patient. And what we know that even in those patients that don't have that kind of catastrophic loss, that the function of that microbiome will also be dramatically altered. So all aspects of the microbiome are changed. And when you damage any ecosystem, you damage a rainforest, you damage an oceanic ecosystem, you damage, a reef, what happens is that there are winners and there are losers. So what'll happen is you'll kill out all of those lovely mutualists, but there will be some resistant strains that survive. And those tend to be in actors that are perhaps less good for our health, and they will bloom and they will become abundant, and they will then have secondary health implications. So I see a lot of patients in my practice who have what I would refer to as sort of post-antibiotic microbiome scarring that's been labelled as IBS. And what happens? They get to see a doctor who says, well, you've got bacterial overgrowth, so we'll give you more antibiotics. And they get more antibiotics and more, and they just go round and round and round in a cycle. And what we lack in clinical practice is this idea of microbiome conservationism, this idea that actually you are dealing with a sophisticated biodiverse ecosystem that's highly individualized, and actually what it needs is a bit of TLC. It needs some rest, it needs some space, it needs some room to grow back. And quite often that's a less is more strategy, right? It means thinking about that individual holistically. It means making lots of incremental changes to their kind of healthcare strategy, whilst you give the microbiome a little bit of time just to bounce back to where it is. And sometimes it will do that just on its own. So again, standard good medical practice. If you're unwell and your doc says you really need this medicine, take the medicine and don't feel guilty and don't worry about it. Okay. But what you can do is do things to conserve the microbiome and to protect it. And I'll talk about that in a second. So that's number one. And if you're in pain, take the painkiller, right? Like, for God's sakes.
But some people don't. Some people are terrified. I have some friends that will not, doesn't matter how ill they are, they will not take a paracetamol.
Yeah. So paracetamol and microbiome, super interesting. So like the most studied drug of all time, don't know how it works, right? We know some of it, but the majority of it we don't really know. It turns out microbiome, an important determinant of how paracetamol works, because paracetamol requires lots of sulfur to detoxify some of its co-metabolites in the liver, and the microbiome is a sink for sulfur. It needs sulfur. It loves a bit of sulfur. And if you've got too many Clostridium in your gut, you don't have enough sulfur to go to the liver, and you can't detoxify paracetamol. And we think that explains a part of the susceptibility some people have to the toxicity of medicines. So a major kind of the second answer to your question is that the microbiome is like a really critical missing piece in the puzzle in trying to understand drug metabolism. So we think about it almost exclusively in terms of human enzymes, human biological functions, but bugs have this massive catalogue of enzymes to break down drugs. And they also have lots of indirect ways of affecting how drugs work, but also how toxic they are. So I work in the field of cancer and cancer research, and that's hugely important for how chemotherapies work. Really, really critical. But I think there's a kind of more philosophical answer to your question, right? And it comes back down to our addiction to medicines and our addiction to relying on medicines to solve, a lot of the self-inflicted healthcare problems that we have. And it is a problem because if we don't change our strategy to this, the unsustainable healthcare systems that we currently rely on will collapse, right? There's absolutely no doubt about that. And here's where the microbiome comes in, because what we need is an evolution from 19th and 20th century ways of thinking about healthcare and how we treat diseases. We're trapped in a cycle where actually the solution is for pharma companies to keep us in an extremely profitable state of remission, right? So immune-mediated conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory bowel disease, you take these very, very expensive immune modulators, which don't cure the disease. They don't solve the problem. And I'm arguing that part of the reason that we've got into that mess is because we have applied 19th century logic to the treatment of infectious disease, right? So we germ theory, transformative concept that saved millions and millions of lives and allowed us to be tremendously successful and the population to grow. But we're still trapped in that cycle of all germs are bad, kill all known germs dead. And the consequences of that has been a pandemic of immune-mediated diseases because we don't have a healthy microbiome to educate our immune system. And then we are trapped in a cycle where we are reliant on drugs to solve problems like a mental health crisis, an allergy crisis, an immune-mediated crisis. We've got an obesity pandemic that require all of the drugs that you've just labelled and just given us examples. And so what I'm saying is that actually we've got to rethink things at a really profound and fundamental level. What we need is to evolve from germ theory to a microbiome theory. And a microbiome theory still says pathogens are bad, you need to kill them, and we need to develop more precise ways of doing that. But actually microbiome conservationism is a form of healthcare prevention in and of its own right. It's a goal that we should all sign up to.
I hope this masterclass has left you with some sense of hope and some practical guidance to support your gut microbiome. Whether it's through those small changes in what you eat, how you manage stress, or how you look at your lifestyle or work with your healthcare team, there are always multiple ways forward. If you'd like to dive deeper, you can find links to the full conversations of each of these episodes in the show notes. Until next time, we hope you live well and be well.